Hello, Booknerds. Welcome to the Booknerds podcast. And I'm super excited because we have back with us, I should say back with us, because, we have done some sessions before also. We love all her books. Welcome to the podcast, Achala ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you. Nice to be here.
So, for those of you who are joining in, for the first time or don't know about Achala Moulik's work, I'll tell you a little bit. And of course, today we are here to discuss this book. It's called Portraits of Courage in Indian and Russian Literature. So, for all of you who keep, messaging us about Russian literature, about Bengali literature or Indian literature, this is the podcast you need to watch. It's going to be very informative. Also, I know that you are interested in Russia a lot right now. You can also check out previous podcast with Achala Moulik, and I'll pin it to the comments if you want to watch those. So we'll be discussing this book, but a little bit about Achala ji, and I'll tell you in very short. I have a couple of books hanging out there. You can also look at those, you know. But of course, Achala Moulik received her education in Washington, New York, London, and Rome, where her parents were posted on diplomatic assignments. She graduated from London University with a degree in economics, history, international relations, and international law. In the Indian Administrative Service, she served as Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India and Education Secretary, Government of India. And I must add that during that time, the Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan came into being. So it is very, that is a great acclaim in itself. He has written widely on Russian history and culture and is the recipient of the Pushkin Medal and Yesenin Prize. The Pushkin Medal, writing about Pushkin, and of course, this book has got Pushkin. It's such serendipity, I must say. Some of the books Achala Moulik has written previously are at least what I have read. I'll only mention those. Rest of them I will, pin to the comments again, and you can check them out or buy them from Amazon. Treaty of Peace, Friendship and Cooperation of 1971, commemorating Indo-Russian Russia friendship, and that was discussed recently. And after that, ma'am, if you remember, we were asked about questions about Ukraine and Russia, and all hell broke loose after that. I don't know what's happening there. Uh, Rogues Among the Ruins, of course, it concentrates on the civil servant and the life of a civil servant. And of course, we have portraits of courage in Indian and Russian literature. I must say, first of all, ma'am,
You
this
also
book
did my you also did my novel Dangerous Dispatches.
I completely missed. Dangerous Dispatches. How can I forget? It's. I think it was the novel I read before the Indo-Russia book.
That's right.
That's the book I read. So, guys, I'll pin all of those links in the comments. You guys can go and buy from Amazon and let ma'am know the feedback. How did you like the book? That's very important. But talking about this one, it has got quite an inception story. Every comic book hero or every comic book, Marvel and DC comics have got this inception and origin story. But this book, I'm not comparing it to that, but this book it has got an amazing inception story because it took a while to come into being. And I was talking to the author yesterday as well, and I was amazed. And also, it is mentioned in the book that how long did it take to come into being? Please tell us more about that, ma'am. Our readers would love to know
Yes.
what happened. Why the delay?
Well, first of all, what happened was that my mother and her sister used to write for Bengali journals. Uh, they went abroad very early. My aunt, Masi, went to study in Washington when she was very young, soon after the partition, because they were from East Bengal.
Yeah.
So she went to study in Washington. She was studying American history and literature.
Yeah.
And then she became, I think it's from homesickness, that she began
Yes.
writing about India. And also, such a young girl, and in those days, you hardly saw Indian women in a sari. And here was this 21-year-old girl, and she felt it was her duty that the new Indian embassy had started. So
Yeah.
she felt she had to talk about India. So this was around 1948-49.
Yeah.
So she began writing on many things, and she used to write for Bengali journals about America, America that hardly few Indians knew.
Yeah.
So she began writing a long article on Rabindranath Tagore, which she wanted to give to her college. And she wrote it, and it's a very sad story. And soon after, she was diagnosed with tuberculosis, and she was in a sanatorium. And there she continued to write this and a few other things. And by that time, she had become romantically attached to a young American who was lecturer in the college where she studied.
Right.
And she used to give him, her manuscript to read. And it's very, I mean, it's like a very, almost like a novel. And so when she was going for the lung surgery, because one lung was affected, she gave the manuscript to Justin. He was a very nice young man. And we were off to we went. My father was posted to Washington, and we were supposed to go. And mother was looking forward to being with her brother and her younger sister. And by the time mother arrived, Mercy had passed away. And then soon after, a few months, some months later, Justin came and they contacted us, and he handed over the manuscript of Rabindranath Tagore to my mother. This was during the Korean War. I mean, this must be like history to people like you who are born in the new millennium. And it was very sad, and Justin joined the Korean War, and we never heard of him again. He was a very nice young American. So mother kept this manuscript with her, intending she had three children, husband, diplomatic life. So she never said, "All right, I'm going to do this," regardless. So she kept the manuscript with her, used to go over it. And then she had this idea that she would write about Bengali novelists, writers who had shaped modern Bengal.
Right.
So the great Sharat Chandra Chatterjee, who was very modern. His
Yeah.
views were very modern, very revolutionary, very unconventional. He was abused, but um, he followed more. Though he wrote about Bengal, his ideas were very Western.
Yeah.
So she had this in mind, Sharat Chandra and Tagore, Kazi Nazrul Islam, and all these people. And then she became interested in the anniversary of Bankim Chandra Chatterjee's birth. So mother, after my father retired, they retired to Shantiniketan, she began writing on Bankim Chandra.
Yeah.
And today Bankim Chandra has many other connotations, but it was in that time just a pure literary genius. And he was earlier than Rabindranath. The Rabindranath Tagore fell between Bankim Chandra and Sharat Chandra.
Right.
And they were, of course, unfortunately not so well known, though in Russia they're still well known because they were hugely translated. So their mother wrote this, and she wrote it on Bankim Chandra. Lovely. I learned what I did about Bankim Chandra from that. She wanted to do Sharat Chandra, and she had also passed away very sadly, in a very rare complication of chickenpox. She was very young. And she kept these articles, these essays in a trunk in our house in Bangalore, where I am now. And that trunk remained. So many other artifacts of my parents' travel. I told you yesterday a Japanese scroll given by the emperor to my father.
Yeah.
And one day when we were painting the house, I opened it and there I found it. And then this was in 2014. And I was absolutely shattered. I said, what have I been doing this time? So then I telephoned my sister, went to Calcutta, and I said, Didi, you translate them because they were written in Bengali, beautiful Bengali.
Yeah.
So Aloka translated these two, and I said, we'll have a book on what is the main thing about Bankim Chandra and Rabindranath,
Yeah.
Pushkin and Solzhenitsyn. Incandescent courage.
Yeah.
They lived under One, Solzhenitsyn lived in modern times under Stalin era,
yeah,
Pushkin under very oppressive Tsar, and Rabindranath and Bankim Chandra under British rule.
right,
And how they made great literature out of universal themes and also rebellion.
yeah,
So my sister, translated it,
yeah,
and she passed away, so then we got it published. So it's a story of four authors written by four women.
yeah. And
And
it's
when it was launched at the Russian Cultural Center,
yeah,
the professor there said, Achala, this is like a novel in itself.
yeah.
Four people of the same family writing about these.
Oh yes, it's something very unique. It doesn't happen often. And
Yeah,
the professor, I think so. You're talking about Professor Tatiana, right? And
that's right.
I read an article online, and Professor Tatiana Perova, she's the head of the Russian Language Teachers Training Center,
Yes.
RCST. She says that Achala Moulik's significant contribution to the study of Russian writers as well as Indian writers, bringing into focus the different facets of their lives and career, tabulating for wider readership. So
Mm,
I actually really echo the sentiment, to be honest, because one when one goes to kind of read about Indian writers, especially Bengali writers, and
mm,
Russian literature, one gets kind of overawed by it. You know,
mm, mm,
it's sometimes for the modern reader, for the contemporary reader, it's very hard to go to this literature. But when I was reading it, I was like, this is doable for a first timer also. Even
mm,
if you are reading a book for the first time, you'll be able to understand easily the times and the
mm,
struggle, the rebellion
mm,
you used the word. And most of this literature was out of rebellion. And that's the common thread which I really, kind of gravitating towards.
mm.
Protest literature, which I thought that it's so contemporary right now. Do you think that protest literature can bring out the best in, even in contemporary literature?
Yes. Because protest um, is the response of sensitive human beings to what is going on around them. And this protest need not be political. Unfortunately, today protest means against politics. It's not so.
Right.
Of course, Solzhenitsyn was,
Yeah.
he didn't start, it's the injustices you see around you,
Yeah.
the vulgarity, the injustice, the
Yeah.
cruelty.
Yeah.
And so Rabindranath saw more of protest against foreign rule. And but he also wrote about social themes. He also wrote about normal human existence.
Yeah.
So did Pushkin. But there
Yeah.
came a time in their lives when they had to stand up for a principle.
Yeah.
Now, Bankim Chandra was from a very well-to-do middle-class family. His father was in the British civil service. He joined the British, the Bengal civil service,
Yeah.
and they didn't take part in the mutiny. The Chatterjee family, like the Tagores, they said, "Well, British rule has brought in a lot of benefits,
Yeah.
and under the Mughals, what were we? We were there was a lot of oppression. I mean, you
Yeah.
may argue on this forever, but so they didn't. But while working there in the district,
Yeah.
Bankim Chandra came to see the terrible taxation imposed on the peasants, which was done by the zamindar, and the zamindar would take half of it, pass the half to the British treasury,
Yeah.
and the poor peasant suffered. So when he saw that, that rebellion grew inside him, the injustice of the revenue system. And then it sort of came into a historical perspective. And of course, he wrote a lot on social themes about widows, oppression of widow. It's not political. About, in the famous Durgesh Nandini, that is the daughter of the fort.
Yeah.
Charming story. It's about Rajput prince who comes to Bengal, which is under Muslim Nawab, and fort, the Nawab's daughter the fort keeper's daughter falls in love with the conqueror.
Yeah.
In reverse, the Rajput. But he is from a Rajput family, he can hardly marry a Muslim girl. And so
Right.
he is to marry a Hindu girl, but they had to part, but he showed how religion came in the way of what should have been a very happy union.
Yeah.
So it's not just political, it's social. And finally, I think, it's against the injustice of destiny.
Right.
I think that is the fun. And the Greeks knew that very well. They wrote very bitterly against the injustice of fate.
Right. Great. I really wanted to talk about Alexander Pushkin. I mean, of course, you have in the book you mentioned on page 26. You have mentioned that Pushkin's place in Russian literature is comparable to that of Dante in Italian literature. Separated by 6 centuries, both were the heralds of the Renaissance. Uh,
Hmm.
would you like to comment on that? Because that's quite a comparison that you have
Hmm.
made here.
You see, as I was telling you yesterday, uh, there wasn't much of literature in Russia in the Middle Ages. It was all religious literature, what was sponsored by the church,
Yeah,
and the church was very, very religious, very rich. And strangely enough, the Mongols, the Tatars who ruled Russia, parts of Russia in the Middle Ages, they were
yeah,
very tolerant. They didn't destroy the church, unlike the Islamic people in Spain.
right.
So the religious literature grew there. But in the modern literature began to develop. But it was never very significant, except for this man called Prince Karamzin, who read Shakuntala's translation in German,
Yeah,
done by George Foster, and William Jones's translation, and he became interested in Indian literature. So it's Karamzin who introduced Russians to Indian literature. Peter the Great had set up the Oriental Institute. But it was Alexander Pushkin who started the new theme.
yeah,
No more about, the French styles came through Catherine the Great. So French was comedy of errors, social mores, all that, but not really profound. And it's Pushkin who began an entirely Russian.
yeah,
It was about Russian people. It was not about princes and kings and queens, but about ordinary people.
yeah,
And just like Dante, until Dante of course was 12th century, 13th century, and Dante also wrote about real people. And his famous Divine Comedy is really the journey of a soul,
yeah,
from suffering to redemption. So both philosophical and poetic. So that's why I said they were so much similar.
yeah.
And Pushkin simplified Russian into the colloquial, which is what Dante did. They stopped writing in Latin and wrote in the vernacular.
Yeah. That is so interesting because one needs to be rooted, and you have mentioned this at various places in the book also. One needs to be rooted in the culture to kind of bring out the best literature, which is
Mm,
so relevant to Indian writing as well.
mm,
Also about Alexander Solzhenitsyn, you have commented that the modernization of Soviet Union came with heavy cost to her people. Collectivization affected millions of farmers. Writers,
mm,
artists, and intellectuals who protested against government policies were persecuted, imprisoned, and even executed. And in fact, he was sent into exile.
mm.
If I'm not
No,
wrong, it was to the US.
Solzhenitsyn.
Yes, yes, yes.
Solzhenitsyn was not sent. I mean, he went into exile.
He
They
went into
asked him
exile.
to leave Russia,
Yeah,
and unlike other emigres who went off to the West and had a good time, this
yeah,
man said, "I would rather have been killed, executed than exiled, banished," because he
yeah,
said my roots dried up abroad, and he was not in the least bit impressed by his American new residence. He didn't like it, and
yeah,
it was in America he began writing against Western
yeah,
civilization, Western practices. So he was not, it was a favorite term of my father. He was not a cultural conquest. He remained
okay,
a Russian, a loyal Russian to the end. Because many of the authors who leave Russia because they think they've been, they get anti Russian when they go abroad. He didn't. In fact, he couldn't. once they said he left the Russian soil, he ran out of inspiration.
Right.
Mm.
So it,
But he
uh,
did. He wrote very bitterly against totalitarianism. But
right.
what we forget, what the West forgets, is there were many authors, which is I've mentioned in my first book on Russian literature,
Yeah.
um, that many young writers who were first very devout communists
Yeah.
after the revolution, when they started seeing the onset of authoritarianism, they
Yeah.
wrote against it, and many of these young people were sent off to jail.
Right.
And Russia has a tradition of protest.
Right. And
They're not happy unless they're in rebellion.
we can see that. We can see that right now as well. Also,
Mm.
I feel I sensed a real thread between India and Russia, at least in the literature, and how the Indian writers also got inspired by a lot of those, amazing Russian writers, the Gorky,
Tolstoy had a great influence on Indian writing.
yeah, Tolstoy, Gorky, and all those Chekhov, and all those people, and of course Pushkin. And
Mm.
uh, what is the thread that kind of connects us to their writing?
I
At least
think it's
that,
sorry, please go on.
yeah, yeah. So, what is the thread that connects, the writers? I mean, what is the inspiration that overtake you?
Well, I think they, in a different way, Russia didn't have foreign rule after Mongolia, the Tartars were driven out.
Yeah,
We lived under some kind of alien rule from 11th century onwards
yeah,
until independence. So it was a kind of, dilemma. The Russians lived under their own oppressive rulers. Not the Muscovite kings, the authoritarian setting as a reaction to the French Revolution.
yeah,
So, ironically, before the French Revolution, the Russian authors were much more free to write on their themes. The grand princes didn't interfere, the church. It was after the Russian Empire really became strong, and when the Tsars feared, the bogey of revolution and liberalism, that Russian literature actually blossomed.
right.
And the same thing happened in India. A whole lot of writers blossomed under the the British rule.
Right. You have made a comparison between, and you mentioned it also, between Bankim Chandra's Urkesh Nandini and Pushkin's Captain's Daughter.
The captain's
This is,
daughter, very
this
uh,
is fascinating for me. I mean, tell us more about that because
uh,
it's a short part in the book, but tell us more, please.
well, the captain's daughter was Pushkin's one of his short novel, and it's in Russian. It's called Kapitanskia Devochka, and that is the story of the famous Pugachev rebellion, which was against the Tsarina. It's a very complicated rebellion, but and Pugachev, his rebellion, and because it was against injustice, and it was a peasant revolt, and they joined and they were sweeping across Russia until they came to this lonely fortress which controlled the Urals.
Yeah,
So they had to stop the rebellion there. And this was this lonely fortress in the middle of nowhere. And the fortress, like Durgesh Nandini, fortress keeper, and the daughter. And the young man comes. He's, of course, not a Rajput prince, young Russian officer. And he has to take the fortress, take command.
yeah,
And of course, here the interesting part is that Pugachev is in the story,
right,
and how the young Russian officer makes a deal
right,
with the very rebel that he has come to arrest, and how this girl is they fall in love. But that story has a happy ending because
yeah.
both Peter Grinov and Masha are both Russians. Whereas Durgesh Nandini, Jagat Singh, and Ayesha are different religions.
So yeah, I mean one of Pushkin's uh, poems you have mentioned here. It was quite beautiful. Can I read it? Because I would love everybody to perhaps know about it. Because not everybody is exposed to this poetry.
Mm.
I mean, we are exposed to a lot of American and British, writing. But this is something which is kind of, unexplored for many.
Please
So,
do.
on Pushkin's deathbed, he composed perhaps the most beautiful of his poems.
Mm.
And it goes like this: dedication to Madhya. This is for you, but will the rhythm of this dark music touch your ear? And will your modest nature fathom my heart's unruly striving here? Or will the poet's bold submission at first as once of love again pass by without your recognition, as unacknowledged now as then? Know it again, at least the rhyme that once I think was dear to you, and know that since that parting chime, whatever changing fate I knew, the memory of words last spoken by you and your sad wilderness have been my only sacred token, sole refuge, and ultimate address. It's beautiful, and I mean we have read so much of poetry in school, college, whatever, but these things it is not in our books at all. So it's quite interesting to explore this.
In
What is
fact,
the first? Yeah,
yeah, say
uh,
what you
I
say,
don't know
Lord?
how I don't know how good I am at reciting poetry, but I loved the text and the meaning a lot. Also, what are the devices, or what is the one thing that you love about Pushkin's writing? Is it the literary devices that he used? Is it the experiences that he had, over a period of time? And those were some experiences. Let me tell you guys, if you will read the book, you know what I mean. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, this poem, when I read when I was very young, it stayed in my memory as a
Okay.
very sad poem. And he was in love with Maria, but
Yeah.
very foolishly he went and married, a very pretty but empty-headed girl.
Yeah.
And they came to marriage, and somehow they drifted apart. And they were both very much in love. So I read this poem, and it stayed in my memory. And in 207, 206, I wrote a play called Pushkin's Last Poem, and that was performed in Moscow and Petersburg.
Right.
The play by
Yeah.
Indian actors in the year of India and Russia.
Yeah.
Now, what is so charming about Pushkin, apart from his great literary, I mean, he was a giant, is that simplicity of his thoughts.
Yeah.
And he went, it was all very clear, like a very clear melody.
Yeah.
Our human destiny, our sadness, our oppression.
Yeah.
And he didn't want to please anybody. And he wrote against injustice. And he got into trouble with the Tsar. And the Tsar brought him to St. Petersburg to keep him under his eye. And then it became, and he wrote, Ode to Liberty and other things. So there's something very simple and yet very wise in Pushkin. And another thing which is perhaps, which endeared me, when Maria, the girl to whom this poem was written, when Maria's husband took part in the Decembrist revolt, he told her, he was asked that, she secretly loves you, go and tell her not to join her husband in exile in Siberia. She's just got a small baby, she can't go to Siberia. So Pushkin came to the house of this prince and he argued with her, don't go. And then finally she said, I give up. She won't. She was very obstinate. She feels it's her duty to go to exile in Siberia. Imagine a princely family going off. And you know what he called her? He had read the Ramayana. Imagine in 1825, this
Yeah.
Russian poet had read about the Ramayana and he called Maria daughter of the Ganges.
Wow. Yeah. And
So
that was quite something reading about that, and that part was fascinating for me as well.
huh. And Robin, it's at a time when Indian literature, Indian epics were hardly known in Europe.
Right.
And the British, except the great Indologists like William Jones, Halhed, and others, Asiatic Society, the
Yeah.
ordinary English, they knew nothing about Indian culture, Indian
Right.
literature. This man had read their
Right.
That endured me to him.
Let's take up a few questions. There are some. So the first one is I'm taking is by Arifi. You mentioned in your book how differently four of them could have led their life without any hassle, but they chose a different path for themselves. How much do you relate to them? What would have been your choice if you were in such a position? I just wish that you were in never in such a position. But it's a hypothetical question, perhaps.
No, I was in that position,
You
and
were?
this is, yeah, this is related
Okay.
to Aruki. I'm saying this
Yeah.
is has been narrated, of course, through a man's experience in Robes Among the Ruins.
Okay.
This choice, where you could have side passed, gone bypassed it, and I was asked to clear a file of
Hmm.
78 pieces of sculpture
Right.
by a notorious family. I won't mention the details because tomorrow I don't want any problem. And they just wanted me to regularize it by
Okay.
saying it can be registered.
Okay.
I said before I register it and regularize it, I want to know where you got them from. It's called provenance. Where you got it, what time, etc.
Yeah.
They refused. They're very powerful. Their two cousins, one was in the prime minister's office, the other was. I mean, they were thakus, but they were also dacoits.
Okay.
So put enormous pressure, and this is when my empanelment as Secretary Government of India was coming. So they really had the knife. Now they were bothering me. They were sending all sorts of ruffians, do this, do that. We found it in our fields. We had it in our grandfather's house. I said, give it to me in writing.
Yeah.
Without writing, I can't. So they harassed me, very much so. And I had to wait 2 years, and I dug my heels in. Then the Prime Minister's office sent a man to the Secretary of Culture to clear that file, even though he had a CBI case against him. And he asked me to do it. I wrote such a damning note, not God Himself could change it. And I had to make a choice. Do I want to be secretary? Many of my friends said, you want to be secretary or you want to fight these dacoits? So I said, no, I want to fight the dacoits. I'm
Wow.
not going to let 80 pieces of fabulous sculpture of our country in India to be sold at Sotheby's in Crystal. So, we sometimes, and I was a very happy go lucky officer, I didn't have any, I must fight this cause. But at a time it comes in your life, you have to say so much and no more. I won't. I won't collaborate in crime.
Yeah.
So we don't know. I said, yes, I could have gone. In fact, somebody said my husband was posted then as advisor at Jammu Kashmir.
Yeah.
So a friend said, why don't you just take leave and go to Kashmir, stay there, and let your second in command handle the file? I
Yeah.
said, no, that's a tacit collaboration. So maybe all of us in our lives sometime, and I've showed this in my novel,
Yeah.
that's at all stages in our life, somewhere or other we have to make a choice between safety and principles. And all of them did.
Yeah. I think that was quite rebellious in the same vein as these four people who are mentioned in the book. Also, there's one more question. Achal is asking, there's a plethora of material in the author's works you could have chosen from, but every excerpt you have included seems very intentional. How did you choose which ones would add to the essence of the book?
Yeah. Well, you see, the main thing is I chose was courage was rebellion.
Yeah.
I wanted to actually, the original title was Portraits of Rebellion. But then my publisher said, there's so
A
many
little bit,
problems about this.
yes, a little bit too much, perhaps.
Yeah, it might attract, but maybe it should have been Portraits of Rebellion. And these people were to return the knighthood, but Rabindranath Tagore did to the British Empire.
Yeah.
As a slap on their face, which no Indian has done.
Yeah.
No Indian. Sir
Yeah.
C.V. Raman, Sir Ramaswamy Iyer, all the rest of it, Jagdish, nobody returned the
Everybody
knighthood.
compromised. Everybody compromised some or the other way, at some point in time. Yeah.
Quiet. And Jallianwala Bagh was being enacted in front of them. They didn't return the knighthood. They
Right.
slunk away. I had to once tell this to the son of one of these sirs. I said, don't talk, huh? Don't talk big, you know, what it is. So there were many, I agree with answer, there were many choose from.
Yeah.
Dostoevsky was a rebel.
Oh yes. Oh yes.
You might
Totally.
be, there's a second edition, I'll include
I think
Dostoevsky.
so. I think so because I really wanted to know about these authors, Chekhov and Tolstoy, and kind of reading on what went on, what were their inspirations. It sounds very interesting. Perhaps in a later book, in a later edition, there's one more question I really wanted to take. I think Aditya is asking, can you talk to us about the choice to use literature in order to establish the commonalities between India and Russia? Were there other options that you considered? I mean, of course, you have been in the administrative services. You must have had so many chances to kind of explore that. What makes, I think that's the question. How does literature kind of connect the both countries? Is
Mm.
it good? How does it affect the relations?
Well, it's modern Russian literature. I don't know how much. Post revolution, I don't know how much effect. Of course, it did affect the proletarian literature, Maxim Gorky, you know, the life of the working class. That has influenced many writers in Bangladesh and Bengal and UP, Punjab. Many were influenced by that. The protest against employers and
Yeah,
people who work like that. The famous film, though,
right.
because I mean, it's like that. But I think it's pre-revolution Russia which inspired many of our classical writers because it was about, it's a huge spectrum, it's a huge canvas that they worked against. And that is, I think, what Bankim Chandra and Sharat Chandra, Rabindranath was, of course, very original.
Yeah,
So, and I think it's the fact that even if we don't have commonality, I think it's the Russian which I put in my book on the Indo-Soviet Treaty
yeah,
that Indians should realize that the Russians were the only Europeans, only just white, I hate to use the word, but
yeah,
the only white race which gave India the respect that we deserved, and they called it a great civilization at a time when Europeans were trying to denigrate us because that's rule. When you rule a person, you have to make them feel small.
yeah,
You can't rule a, and they did. They tried to demolish our civilization until the, people like William Jones and the excavations began. Even until Mohenjo-daro was excavated and discovered, they tried to, Max Muller and that gang said, oh, Indian civilization began 1000 BC. Then Mohenjo-daro Harappa blew the lid. You found it was as old as Sumeria, Babylon. So, but Russia was one country, one European country, under a Tsar, imperial Tsar, and they paid respect to Indian civilization.
yeah, yeah.
So that is
Uh,
our commonality.
yeah.
And
Thank you
I,
so
I
much. Yeah,
and I think the young people who are listening in, I'd like to tell them, don't go in for the media reports on Ukraine. Try to remember this country was our friend.
yeah,
Nobody likes war. Nobody likes to see children killed.
yeah,
But we should remember that this country came to our rescue in 1971,
yeah,
during the mutiny, during the Indian mutiny,
yeah,
when the whole of the Europe, the Western world was watching the slaughtering of Indian rebels. The
yeah,
Tsar took in Victoria, saying, the way you're treating the rebels, shoot them, he said. If they're rebels, shoot them, but to execute them in a decent way. Don't throw them from the mouths of cannons.
right,
Don't hang their bodies to rot in the sun.
right. You're so right, ma'am, because Russia has always stood up for the, I mean, all those countries which were plagued by colonialism. I mean, Russia always stood up for them.
Mm. After the revolution, Russian Revolution, it was always for liberation of the oppressed people.
Yeah. So we need to remember that. And we have taken many questions. Shashank also in the comments is, recommending some documentaries as well, to watch along with the books about Indo-Russia relationship. Of course, guys, you can add this. catch hold of this one also. A side read for you guys. Do read this one also
The young people
because
would read this.
yeah,
I wish the young people would read this to know the
yeah,
entire background of the relation between
yes.
India and Russia.
Yes. That's why I
And
call
then,
your books a universe. I call you, sorry to cut you off, but I that's why I called your books a universe, because you need to read all of them to understand the universe that you're talking about. Not many people are doing that. Not many writers are doing it. So it is very unique. Treaty of Peace, Friendship, and Cooperation of 1971. Read this one, and then of course to go a little light, because this one will get heavy on you a little bit. Go for portraits of courage in Indian and Russian literature, uh,
and
and
I just interject, Rohan,
yeah,
I'd like the young people to know or hear that Bankim Chandra's the poem which he wrote in his novel Anandamat, it's
yes,
about the Sannyasi rebellion.
yeah,
There he composed the song Vande Mataram.
yeah,
It comes
yeah,
there.
yes.
And the British tried to tone him. He said, nothing doing. This poem remains. He
And
didn't get him.
I totally missed talking about Vande Mataram, because there's a story right in the book. Of course, don't tell too much, because otherwise people will not buy the book. But just tell us a little bit about, kind of, there is a story behind the making, and
Hmm.
obviously Tagore also wished that perhaps it should have been the national anthem.
Yeah, he said that should have been the national
Yeah.
anthem, but
But we
they
shouldn't
said,
tell them too much. We shouldn't tell them too much, because
yeah, okay.
you need to buy the book. Tell us on Amazon, Goodreads, wherever, and review the book. Give your feedback. It always helps the author,
Yeah,
and gives us perspective also. Whether our opinion about the book, what was our opinion about the book,
that's
what did
right.
we feel compared to yours. So it's very important. Glad having you again on the podcast. It will
Wonderful,
always be
yeah.
fun and very, I get to learn so much whenever I read another book by you. Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for doing this. And
Thank
we'll
you
meet
for doing this.
perhaps soon in another podcast, and perhaps an offline session in Doon very
Sure, I
soon.
love that.
I
I
will-
love that. I hope
Thank you
the
so much.
I hope your audience liked the discussion.
They will love it. If they haven't watched it right now, you can always go back. It is always on YouTube, Facebook, and LinkedIn also now. So it is there as well. So do watch it again. You can, I'll be putting timestamps, so you can watch it in pieces as well if you don't have enough time. That is always good. I mean, some of us don't have time. We work a lot, but try to make time for this. More importantly, read the book. More than the session, read the book. That is more important. And we'll see you in another podcast. And other books and other bookish content, you can always check out our social media channels. Do tune in, and yeah, I'll see you in the next episode. Thank you so much, ma'am, for doing this. It was always a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you. All the best. Thank you.
Thank you.